in our country, in this culture, I think, most of us, the vast majority of us, didn't have a great sex education of our own. Every time I get in conversations with people about what their sex education was like when they were growing up, people usually laugh or have this like grimace on their face, or they just, they make fun of it because it's so just either non-existent or way off the mark, didn't really give them any useful tools, and maybe actually gave them a lot of like misinformation or fear.
I have very vivid memories of specific of this topic, and they all had shame mixed in, right? Like, that was like a kind of a common thread, like sitting in 5th grade when they did the sex talk, but like never actually talked about sex. Like, I'm pretty sure we got out of that topic never actually talking about sex, just talking about puberty and bodies changing and wet dreams and things like that. And then we looked up sex in the encyclopedia secretly at a sleepover with like a couple other boys, and that's where I actually learned the mechanics of sex. You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father. Today's episode is about every parent's favorite topic, sex education. It can be such a taboo thing to talk about. Many of us may avoid it or fumble through it and even intentionally deliver some of the wrong messages. And so that's why today I have Megan Brinkerhoff on the podcast. Megan is a mother of 2. She's got a 6.5-year-old daughter and a 3.5-year-old son. And she's spent the last several years really deeply examining how we learn about sex, relationships, boundaries, and is currently developing a class for parents and small children. Our kids actually start getting messages about sex and sexuality way before puberty. So in this episode, we go into how we set up our kids with a healthy foundation starting as early as toddlerhood and how to address at the various stages of development going forward. This one really helped give me the tools I needed to talk to Della about this very touchy subject in a way that I know is healthy and honest, and really is helping me avoid those quiet mistakes that create shame without me even realizing it. So if you're wondering how to talk to your kids about sex without creating shame, this episode's for you. Hey everyone. Super excited to have my friend Megan Brinkerhoff on the show today to talk about sexuality and kids and how we talk to our kids about sexuality at different ages. Really cool, important topic. Megan, we met at that weird event, Submersive, this kind of strange, interactive, cool music, biohacking art thing, and started talking about this topic. And I was like, oh man, my wife and I talk about this all the time. How do we make sure we're teaching our daughter the right things and at the right stages and in an appropriate way and a comfortable way? And you let me know you're trying to create maybe some kind of class or course for parents. So I was like, man, I want that. But it's not quite ready yet. So in the meantime, let's have you on the show and just talk about what you've learned about it so far and go from there.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's super kind of you to ask me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about this work.
For sure. No, very few
Yeah.
people are willing to talk about this. So excited to dive in. What had you interested in, you're a parent yourself, right? So like, tell us about your kids and how you came to be interested in teaching parents about sexuality.
Sure. I mean, definitely before even becoming a parent, I had these questions in my mind of how I might broach this subject when the time came with my own children. But what really accelerated me down this path was about a year and a half ago, a little over a year and a half ago, my marriage began to fall apart. And that sent me down my own sort of path of deeper internal investigation and self-discovery. And a lot of what I was uncovering in that work of just sort of like what happened to this relationship, where did I lose myself in this relationship? I started really touching into some really deep and important questions about my own development starting way, way, way back in my childhood and teenage years of how I learned to create relationships, how I learned to show up in relationships, and certainly aspects of how I showed up in those romantic relationships sexually. And it was really through a process of my own self discovery and work on myself that I started to think, gosh, I can't wait to share this with my kids when they're old enough. I'd read a book or I'd go to a workshop or I'd learn something new and I'd think about, wow, I'm definitely going to like make sure my kids know this in a way that I never got the opportunity to. But then it really dawned on me more and more that by the time they were old enough to read that same book or take that same course, they were already going to be pretty far along in their mindset around what sex was, what relating was. And so I was like, okay, well, I need to figure out how to like take this same information and make it more appropriate to their age and make it more digestible for them. And the more I got to thinking about that, I was like, well, if I'm going to go through all of this work to do this for my kids, I bet there's other families out there, other like minded parents that want to have these kinds of really candid and open conversations about sex and relating with their children. That it just sort of naturally evolved from there. I was really kind of resistant to it. Like, am I really going to become a sex educator? And the more I dug into it, the more I actually really found such a deep passion for this work, such a deep calling around not just educating children, but also addressing, like you said at the beginning, like this huge piece about why parents tend to outsource this conversation to a school, a religious institution, or just hope that their friends or somebody helps them figure it out. Um, and why parents feel just ill-equipped and awkward and scared to have these conversations themselves about sex. So I realized like I need to create something that's not only about educating the kids, but really educating parents in tandem so that they can reclaim their role as the stewards of their children's sexual and relational development.
And how old are your kids now?
My daughter is 6.5, and my son is 3.5.
Okay. And before we go into like exactly what you've said or how has it felt to talk to them about it? Like what's it like to openly talk about sexuality to them?
Yeah. So of course, there's things that are age appropriate, things that they can, understand, concepts that they can grasp and things that might be a little bit beyond them. And I started talking to them about their bodies and a little bit about sex even before I formally wanted to become a sex educator, but at this stage, what I try to do is if I'm directly asked a question about anything, I try to come up with an answer that is honest and again within what I feel are the boundaries of what they can really understand at this point in time. But even if I'm not being directly asked a question like, how are babies made? Or, where do babies come from? Or something like that, I'm really at a stage where I'm trying to create an environment within my home of acceptance for them however they show up. And that's not just about sex and how they are in their bodies, how they are with their bodies, but also, their feelings and their needs and how we make space for how they show up as a whole person and created an environment where they know that there isn't a particular topic or you know
Mhm.
conversation that needs to be whispered or needs to be reserved for a specific time or within a certain
You
environment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
um and I'd say, I feel really lucky that I have both a boy and a girl because that starts to break down some of the silos pretty immediately, just in terms of like, they take baths together, they see each other's bodies, like they know the names of each other's parts, and so there's a lot of openness in that, and of course, it's completely neutral and nothing is, at this stage in their life sexualized. They don't have any of those inputs yet. But yeah, just trying to create a really like welcoming, open and welcoming of their curiosity about their bodies and everything that's going on in their
Is it
bodies.
is it still uncomfortable for you? Like, are you at this place where it's like natural? Oh, I'm excited to talk about it, or is it still like that kind of oh, what do I say? Awkward feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I get, surprised with a question that I, wasn't ready for, I try not to, even if I do feel awkward about it, I might try not to seem awkward about it. But certainly I do because I'll be like, oh wow, I wasn't expecting that. I don't really have I don't have a canned or prepared answer for everything. But there is a child psychologist who I follow that a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with, named Dr. Becky Kennedy. And one of the things that she says about it is, if even if you do get awkward when you're having a conversation with your kid about sex, it's one of the things you can do with that is point out to them that it's not the topic that is awkward or wrong, but the fact that like I myself have never like had a conversation like this before, or my parents didn't have a conversation about this before. And so just like anything we do for the first time that might feel a little awkward or uncomfortable, like, that's why you might notice me being a little awkward or uncomfortable, but it's not because what we're talking about is awkward and uncomfortable. It's just that I might be awkward and uncomfortable in this moment.
Right. And so
Mhm.
you referenced Betsy. How else did you prepare yourself when you decided, like, oh, I want to become an expert on this? I want to help teach this. What? Who else did you learn? What did you read?
Gosh, I mean, I've read so many people. Emily Nagoski is another wonderful author. She wrote the books "Come as You Are" and "Come Together." And if you don't know anything about like your attraction styles and your attachment styles and things like that, there's tons of great information there. But also, books not specifically about sex. I mean, digging into things like nonviolent communication, and just being really in touch with your feelings and your needs and sort of taking responsibility for those things. There's another wonderful book by a woman named Betty Martin called The Art of Giving and Receiving, and it's really about all of the dynamics around consent. And of course, consent shows up. We talk about it a lot in the context of sex, but it's really, we're consenting or not consenting to things all the time in our lives. And so, yeah, that's why my program is really not just about sex, but about relating and how sex is a component of relating and about a component of being a whole person. Because this is really about, um, not just knowing like the biology and reproduction and all of those kinds of things, but like what are boundaries and how do we maintain them? How do we create them and hold them? How do we develop the skills of attunement? How do we understand consent and the ways that it shows up in all aspects of our lives? And so it's, I'm reading a lot of adult based literature, but doing a lot of filtering, distilling, and translating of like, these are concepts that are really actually just foundational for how to grow up and be kind of like a fully embodied human. And how do we make that? How do we start having those conversations really early with our kids?
Yeah, it's really you're saying that kind of healthy sexuality starts with like a healthy self-image in general, setting boundaries physically or consent starts in outside the bedroom. It starts with, how we stand up for ourselves or say no to things, which of course kids are doing all day long. Yes, I want
Mhm.
no, I don't want that, and learning that. So that makes me feel better that like at least like if we haven't talked about sex overtly, like we talk a lot about that, about how you take care of your body and how it's your body and they can't touch it if they don't want to and other people have their boundaries and also that she's a whole powerful amazing person. She doesn't need anybody's validation or like she can feel good about herself. Seems like so much of that kind of early sexual experimentation or teenage pregnancy or some of these issues often stem from what this like self-image and stuff that has nothing to do with sex directly. But if we can attack that early, it sets the
Yeah. Yeah, if we can create a really solid foundation in our children's relationship to themselves, creating trust and safety and validation and love of ourselves, we're creating a really strong foundation upon which they can build all of their relationships and model all of their relationships in their life going forward, be they friendships, work relationships, or romantic relationships.
Yeah, that's awesome. So that's great. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are doing some of that anyway. So when it comes to specifically sex and sexuality, why is that so hard to talk about? What are the barriers most parents have or that you had to talking about this openly with kids?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in our country, in this culture, I think, most of us, the vast majority of us, didn't have a great sex education of our own. Every time I get in conversations with people about what their sex education was like when they were growing up, people usually laugh or have this like grimace on their face, or they just, they make fun of it because it's so uh, just either non-existent or way off the mark, didn't really give them any useful tools and maybe actually gave them a lot of like misinformation or fear. So, it's really hard to do something that you don't have any modeling around. That's really hard and that's legit. And then add on top of that, an entire lifetime of experiences that you know I'd say it would be very surprising to me to meet someone who would say they've had like a completely smooth and enjoyable history of like romantic and sexual experiences where it was always great, it was always pleasurable, everybody always had a wonderful time.
Determined for
You
my
know,
daughter to say that, by the way. She's gonna
right, right.
30 years, she's gonna say that, I've decided.
It's going to be amazing.
Because of
That's
this
what we're setting
episode,
them up for.
she's gonna be yeah, it's gonna be perfect.
Yeah. So not only did we not have the educational background, but we've got all of this experience that has been for some people awkward, for some people just not very pleasurable, for some people, about a lot of different things and not necessarily about like deep healthy connection to ourselves or to another person. Or some people have like really deep trauma and abuse and assault and so we're arriving to these conversations with our children with a lot of history and not a lot of tools. And I think all of us, even if we've had deeply traumatic experiences, want to hope and believe that the experiences of our children can be very different, but it's really hard to pretend that all of that personal history isn't here and not bring all of that into the conversation with our kids. So I think that might be another reason why people shy away or shut down because they don't want to pass off their trauma to their children, or they just don't know how to not, and so a lot of the work of my program is to address head on like what are some of the fears, what are some of the blockages, like find where within the parents themselves are they're like butting up some of the most resistance, and see how we can then give the tools, give the language, acknowledge their experience, and also show them how they can help write a new future for their kids.
Yeah, I got the impression that my parents maybe thought teaching me about it would be like encouraging it. Like, it was like, if you watching a crime show makes you wanna commit the crime or something. Like, somehow, like, if they were to be open and okay talking about what it is and how it works and, that would in some way teach me that it was okay then to go and try to do it, like, right,
Mhm.
when actually I think the opposite was the case, like, because it was so taboo and I pursued it secretly, it was more exciting, more alluring. More
Mhm.
my parents forbade me, the more I wanted to just do it, and, like, I was smart enough to be safe in high school, but, from a physical standpoint, at least, couldn't say from an emotional standpoint at all, but like a lot of kids, if you don't teach them sort of the opposite is true, they're more likely to engage in risky behavior without that. solid, knowing they can talk to their parents, they can go, they can ask questions, they're not going to be judged. So kind of creating that mentor relationship early on is what you're sounding like you're doing, saying, "Hey, we could talk about this, and I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to tell you the facts."
Yeah, and, think about, like, the thing that is kept secret, kept in a box, kept in a way, but it exists. Um, how much, weird, sensationalization or fetishization or desire you actually create for the thing. Like, no, the sugary candy is kept way up on the top shelf and you're never going to have it or whatever, or it's bad. And then there they go, sneak it up onto the kitchen counter in the middle of the night to grab the jar or whatever. And so there's that, but also, as we know, growing up, like, kids are gonna learn about sex, and they're gonna learn it from somewhere. You know, a lot of times, our first encounters with a thing become the kind of indelible benchmarks that we compare all future experiences to. Not always, but that happens a lot. And by, I think, speaking to our children early and often about sex, we are having some say in what that benchmark looks like. We are helping to give them a frame of reference for what sex and relationships are, healthy sex and healthy relationships are, so that as they continue to be exposed to the world and eventually see things like pornography, because they're going to see it, they will have this really filled in frame of reference, and hopefully be able to say, okay, well, maybe that's sex too, but I know that's not all that sex is. That's not creating my understanding of this is what it has to look like, this is what it has to sound like, this is who needs to be involved, this is what the bodies should look like. Um, so having these conversations helps us as parents get in there first before the world inevitably else comes in, and adds to that definition.
Yeah, all my early I don't have a lot of early memories in general, like, I just don't remember a lot of my childhood. But, like, I have very vivid memories of specific of this topic, and they all had shame mixed in, right? Like, that was, like, a kind of a common thread of, like, from when I was the littlest kid and this other boy wanted to do these things with me that, like, like, I didn't really quite understand, but I knew were shameful, to, like, sitting in 5th grade when they did the sex talk, but, like, never actually talked about sex. Like, I'm pretty sure we got out of that topic never actually talking about sex, just talking about puberty and bodies changing and wet dreams and things like that. And then we looked up sex in the encyclopedia secretly at a sleepover with like a couple other boys. And that's where I actually learned the mechanics of sex. We had all those encyclopedias. Remember those shelves? We got looking upstairs with the S book and like looked it up, and that's where I learned the mechanics. Was like, oh, that's kind of weird that that's how that works. And then my next memory is Greece when at the end Rizzo's excited she's not pregnant. That was where I was like, oh, teenagers. Oh, that means she had sex. She's a teenager when she's cool. Like she's the cool kid. Some of them were having sex, and they were afraid. They were a little shamed about it too. Like they were afraid they were pregnant. Now they're glad they're not. And so it's like all these like shame messages. And then in high school, when I became sexually active, my parents, of course, were just consistently upset about it. Like I was not very secretive. Like I'm a pretty hard. I can't get away with anything. So they caught me at everything I ever did. And like they would every time it was sexual in nature, it was always this like shame talk and fear mongering and forbidding and all this stuff. So yeah, mixing that shame in, I think, is really dangerous. So I feel like if there's one thing I have done so far, it's like, let's avoid shame. Like there's one thing not to do. It's keep shame out of it. I think we should keep shame out of all parenting and childhood in general. Like that shame is the enemy, but especially when it comes to sex, it seems like so much of sexual dysfunction or inappropriate behaviors or risky behaviors come from some kind of shame.
Mhm, mhm. Totally. And it's so, um, just endemic to our culture now that, we even as parents with, like, the best of intentions might accidentally be perpetuating that in really subtle ways that our children are picking up on. And so, I think about, like, even just using the word sex and saying it out loud at the same volume that you would every other word in the sentence, or vulva or penis or, breast. Um, because when we just like drop our volume and whisper it a little bit, like those are really subtle cues and really subtle seeds that we're sowing of, oh, there's something different about this word. There's something maybe secretive, maybe shameful, maybe they don't have that word yet, but like something that's like, I shouldn't talk about it or I should be very careful when I talk about it. And it's not that we don't want to create a mindset of care and importance around these things, but we talk about a lot of things that are careful and important, like don't run into the street when there's traffic moving. And we're not like, don't run in, there's cars out there. We don't like, we don't change the volume for other types of topics. And so, part of it is normalization and doing that through even the subtlest gestures of language. And it's not like we want to be necessarily, I'm not saying like everybody go out to a restaurant in public and have like really deep conversations about reproduction with your children. Like it can still happen within the privacy of our home. We are having conversations with our kids about, even though you're not ashamed of your penis, you still like that is, your private part. And like when you're at home and you're taking a bath or something like that, of course it's appropriate. But like when we go out in public, we wear clothes. We don't, and so you can create delineations around privacy and safety and protection while also not accidentally seeding a sense of wrongness or shame.
Yeah, it starts a lot around nudity. My daughter hates wearing clothes. Well, she's 7 now, so she's been pretty
Mhm.
to be naked, running around, but, she's still a kid, she's still, she still do that, and my mom just is very uncomfortable with it. She, like, is always trying to get her to put at least panties on, like, she just wants her, like, wearing just to cover just those specific private parts, and, like, my daughter just has a really hard time understanding. She's like, why does she care? Like, what's wrong with my booty?" Like, she'll say things like, "They don't wanna see your booty," and she's like, "Why would I wanna see my booty?" I'm like, she has a comfortable, and, like, we talk about being clothes in public. I try to explain that other it makes other people uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with being naked in the front yard, and actually we still let her be naked in the front yard. I just sort of remind her, like, just so you know, people walking by might be uncomfortable. They might, like, be curious, like, are you as long as you are aware of that, and so now it's very weird, like, she'll be naked and somebody's coming over, I'll warn her, "Do you wanna put clothes on?" Sometimes she'll be like, "Yeah," sometimes she will not. Just totally depends. The gender doesn't seem to matter to her. It's more about the vibe. She, like, checks it with the vibe of the person before they come. Do I care about them or not? Somehow she has some rules about when she wants
Yeah.
to put clothes on. I have no idea what they are, but, like, give her the choice, and then, our friends, of course, are chill. They don't care or whatever. She's 7. But that I try to explain that it's, like, some other people's issue. It's nothing fundamentally wrong with seeing your private parts. It's ultimately up to you. As a child, at least, it's up to you. Uh, it's not up to me. Like, there's laws and stuff, like, I can't get away with that. Like, you can, but, but at this point, it's just because they have the issue doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just like, just know it might affect them. And there's so many social rules like that. That's like, that's just a rule because it's just a rule. It doesn't make any sense. Cuss
Mhm.
words are another one. It's like, you say that cuss word, they're probably gonna be uncomfortable, like, your teacher's not gonna like it. My mom is another one, does not like the cuss words, like, Nana's not gonna like that if you say it, it's just no. So they're wrong with the word, but it has this impact.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, Joe. I mean, your approach is super similar to mine. My kids also, their preferred state is nudity all the time. And so is mine, frankly. Like they, I don't walk around the house naked necessarily, but I'm not like, get out of here. What if I'm like getting in and out of the shower? And again, like everybody's families are gonna have different levels of comfort. But I do think that seeing bodies, naked bodies outside of a sexualized context is again like laying some sort of foundation in their brains of like a naked body can mean a lot of different things. When you see a mother who's breastfeeding, like that's a function of our body and that's it's there's nothing to hide there. And especially when they're at an age like your daughter and my daughter are really close in age, you know how beautiful is that they haven't yet acquired some of the self-consciousness and body image things that are also inevitably gonna start to come in, and I think the more that we give them these sort of, I think about them as reps, like reps of experience of like, I love my body, I feel really comfortable in my body, I'm not trying to hide my body for anyone else or any reason. When I'm in the comfort of my home, this is how I get to be, even if I know when I go out into the world, I've gotta, like, adopt these other rules. Like, that's some really, I think those are really great reps for establishing that baseline of, like, self-love, really, is what it comes down to. Like, there isn't anything wrong or shameful inherently about my body, and I love my body. That's a really great gift.
Great. Okay, so what kids should know by what ages? I found this Planned Parenthood pamphlet like many years ago, long before I was a parent, that was like what kids should know by age. I was really surprised at like what they should know by like 2 or 3 years old. I don't know where that is. I haven't consulted that, but from your research, start from like I guess I say 0 to 2, but maybe whatever the first developmental stages. I guess they start to talk like what is sort of the first earliest things and what ages should they know?
Yeah, I'm not super, like, statistic oriented, so I'm not gonna be able to give you a really hard answer or clear answer about that, but I do think that, the names of their body parts, as soon as they have language, have the use of language for them, knowing the names, the real names
Yeah,
of their body
middle names,
parts.
like the specific,
Yeah, yeah, and,
like that.
like, eh, and if they have siblings of other genders, like, knowing the names of their siblings' body parts too, I think is a wonderful thing. There's definitely been a lot of research supporting, you know, a child's ability to prevent or at the very least report any kind of sexual abuse when they know the names of their body parts, and can actually, relay that to another person.
I think Dylan
Uh,
was 2 when she told us that her clitoris hurt. That hurt. It hit
Amazing.
my clitoris, I think. I was like, "Oh,
Yeah,
you know these
yeah.
words." Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome that she knows
Before
that.
we just use the words like normal, like, talking about bodies or whatever, and I think, yeah,
Right,
she started talking, she wanted to know what it was called, and we were, of course, always things get hurt, you bonk things constantly, so it's just
right. Yeah, of course,
very
I know.
on learning the words the words, including the clitoris, apparently.
Yeah, I remember one time oh gosh, my daughter, if she ever listens to this when she gets older, will be embarrassed. I think she was, like, riding her bike or something, and she, like, went over a hard bump, and she was like, "My vulva!" Like, screamed it out. And I was like, "That's right, it is your vulva, not your vagina, like, there's a difference there." Um, yeah, just really, really funny. So, yeah, knowing the names of their parts and like I said earlier, being willing to meet their curiosity with honest information, when they bring it to you. Like, my son has never asked about where babies come from. Maybe it's because he's the younger one and didn't, like, get to experience me being pregnant and all of that stuff. But my daughter was very curious about, like, well, the baby's in there, how does it come out of there? And so I've actually had full conversations with her about, like, with anatomical terms about how a woman's body gives birth to a baby, and um she, like, retained that information, and she was like, "Cool," and, like, had follow-up questions, so it just depends on the kid, and I don't think that
You
there's
wouldn't
anything.
ask, is there it sounds like you don't think there's a should around, they should know how a baby's born by age 5 or else there's something wrong. Like, it's more like when they're ready, they'll ask and you just tell them.
Yeah, I think so. I think beyond, like, knowing their own bodies and things that might come up around, like, I mean, of course, we're teaching our children hygiene, as they grow up and we stop doing everything for them and we start expecting them to do some things for themselves. Talking to our kids just about, safety, when it comes to, like, touch and other people's touch. Anytime they're gonna be starting to go out into the world, whether they're like in a daycare environment or a school environment or going to friends' houses, I think starting to have those conversations with them before they start going out into the world, even if it's just really limited conversations like, hey, if you need help, like with anything like this, like, and I'm not here and I'm not around, like, here's what you would do. Um, or if somebody asks to touch you there, or you know that that's not appropriate, like we're not at the doctor, when you're not at home, like those are your private parts and they're not for anyone but you. So there I think it's about like knowing themselves, and certain elements of safety are the only sort of like should conversations that I can think of for earlier on in life. And then um
Like through 2, 3, like how early should that only you can touch your body or only you get to decide? It's just like it was confusing for me because it's like it was originally it was like nobody should touch you there, which is
mm,
like that's a pretty intense thing. Like that's a fairly anti-sexual thing to say. Like it's wrong for anybody to ever touch you there. It's like that's not the message,
right, yeah,
right? Like
right,
it's more like
yeah.
you get to decide who touches you there. So it's like you get to choose. But then it's like, but then, yeah, like what does choice mean if they're pressured by an adult or another kid? Like, so how do you even have that conversation in a way that doesn't shame sex overall, but also says would be
Yeah.
inappropriate for an adult that's not us or a doctor to touch you there? Or like if another kid wants to, it's maybe something you should let us know about.
Yeah, I would say, like understand times when it might be appropriate for me or their doctor or something like that to touch them there. And usually I'm not having conversations like about a theoretical thing that's happening way in the future. Like, hey, we're about to go to the doctor right now, and you might have to get a shot, in your hip or something, which means we're going to need to pull down your pants. And even though I tell you not to pull down your pants in public, like we're going to do it for the specific thing and it's okay. And I'm going to be there with you and blah, blah, blah. Or like, my son, when he was still potty training and needing help wiping at certain times, like, okay, when you're at school, you know how to do it. But if you do need help, it's okay to ask your teacher for help. They know how to do that. They're there to help you in that way. And so trying to give them specific examples of when we might cross some of those boundaries. Um, and then if they are, like going to be at school, like, or if you want to have a conversation, like, hey, if anybody ever asks to see your private parts, just know that like at school, that's not really a thing that's ever going to happen in a way that's okay. Like there's no reason for anybody at school to need to see your private parts, outside of like the example I just gave about, potty training or something. Um or changing a diaper. And so try to make it about your child's life and their experiences, and address something that isn't abstract and theoretical necessarily, but maybe about something, and then say like, and know that you can talk to me about it. Know that I want to know if anybody ever asks you about that.
Yeah, my daughter, Della has really good instincts. Like I've noticed she has like a strong sense of like, is somebody safe or not, or somebody okay? Like she's very friendly. She goes and talks to lots of people. And she somehow knows who like would not be bothered by talking to her. Like she like picks the people out, and they're not people I would necessarily pick out, like they're reading or doing something. I wouldn't bother them, but like they are always very delighted by her attention. And so like there's somehow she knows that. So it's just sort of like I've also comforted around like even if like I don't have this specific conversation, if it felt weird or odd to her, she would like have a red flag about that. Like she would be like, no, I don't, that doesn't seem right to me. Or like I'm gonna tell Nanny about that. That doesn't seem right. Yeah. And so like, but I don't know that all kids necessarily are as attuned as that. So I think some parents probably would need to be very overt, like this is okay, this isn't.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes making a hard boundary might feel safer to say like, yeah, no one ever touches you there, you know, uh, unless I say that it's okay or I'm there with you or something like that. And if they ever ask you to, then you need to ask me first. You know that you need to ask me first. I mean, I don't think you're gonna like
Maybe
Um,
caveat that as a child while you're a child, because at some point they do have the right to let
right, yeah, yeah. I mean,
it's
I
not.
don't think you're gonna do significant harm by making a firm boundary in those earlier years if that helps simplify things, but I also think about, like, creating awareness versus fear and not being like, "There's gonna be people out there that are gonna be trying to get you to show them your private parts, and just don't ever let them do that." Like, try to make it, again, like, more related to their experience, like, when you're at school, if you need help with, wiping, like, even though we've talked about how your private parts are for you and for no one else to touch, like, if you need to ask your teacher for help with that, that's okay. Like, it's just creating a real world example that they can relate to, as opposed to this, like, ambiguous sense of maybe what could be fear, creating fear. I don't know.
Yeah, I think in some of the earliest conversations we had were like, the difference between a romantic relationship and a platonic relationship, like all the books of couples, and then the fact that it's often a man and a woman, but it could be a woman and a woman. It could be a man and a man. And like we had various like kind of queer friendly books that like represented different couples and two moms. And she also had a lot of those in her life, like what I think her preschool was run by a woman in a relationship with another woman. So there was like she had a lot of visibility to that. But there was sort of like that was also I remember that being the Planned Parenthood book that at a very early age, that's one of the key things is that kids know it can look lots of ways.
Mhm.
There is sort of this difference between a like boyfriend girlfriend or a husband wife than like just a friend or like a family.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's all healthy exposure. Don't have in my research and in my program development, I don't have any, things that I could point you to that say when or why or how that's best to introduce that. I think giving kids an opportunity to normalize the way that relationships can look in a lot of different ways, can be important to their own potential development if they're starting to have, like, questions around their own sexual preferences, and gender identities and all of these things like that, that to create an environment, that, like, is welcoming and inclusive to how they might be starting to express themselves, by also giving them examples of how the world expresses itself so differently in so many different ways. Like, I think that that's really healthy and wonderful and could happen at any time.
And we talked she was curious about babies. We had a lot of pregnant friends. My sister-in-law was pregnant. So she's always asking about babies. And she was very clearly on that, babies come from mommy and how they're born and that a man's, like sperm and the egg go together to make the baby, that it's from both people and all that. And I was surprised how long it sort of took her to ask, but then how does that get there? Like, how does the sperm get to the egg? Eventually, she ended up having that conversation with my wife around, I think there was a representation of an erection in some kind of like joking, some TV show or something. It was like, it wasn't like naked, but it was like there was a joke about, a man with an erection or something. She was like curious about that. Like, why would it do that? Direction. So I think at that point, my wife took the opportunity. Said, "This is why. This is how it goes into give the seed." And she kind of heard that and was like, "Okay." And she's never really brought it up again. And it wasn't even about babies remain. It was about erections. But like she had the context of the baby first. I think she was 5 or 6 when we talked about that. So what do you think? Like when the mechanics piece, I was probably 8 or 9 when I looked that up in the encyclopedia. Like, what is there a time frame that's critical for them to understand this is how sex works, or just wait till they ask?
Yeah. So, for the program that I'm developing, the earliest ages that it's designed for is age 8, and it goes all the way through age 18. With different, like, developmentally appropriate, inputs along the way. And in that very first year of age 8 is content around, like, how are babies made? Like, what is sex? And And I think that it's totally appropriate for them to understand the mechanics then and earlier if the conversation comes up. Like I said, I've had that conversation with my daughter. My son's been privy to some of that. I don't know how much he's really absorbed because he wasn't really the one asking. He just happened to also be around when I was answering. Um, I don't think that there's anything wrong about having those conversations earlier, especially if your kid is asking, they're demonstrating some amount of readiness for for something to fill that void of curiosity. The curiosity is there, so let's feed it something that you can continue to add to over time. You might give a very rudimentary, super oversimplified version of an answer that a 5-year-old can understand, and then you can revisit that conversation. Just like you did, you had the conversation about the sperm and the egg, and then the opportunity to talking about an erection and some additional mechanics to the act of sexual reproduction came in just naturally. And that slowly builds their awareness over time. I think that's actually probably more easy for them to digest and integrate than like, here it all is at once when you're, 16 and potentially already sexually active anyway.
Yeah. What are other parts of that 8-year-old curriculum? To
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's sort of like pillars to the program that will be discussed at all ages throughout, and eight eight being the starting point, just beginning to lay in the groundwork around knowing and naming our body parts, knowing and naming our needs and our feelings, very much some of the tactics around nonviolent communication, like I was referring to earlier. Um, what is a boundary? Um, and what is consent? Um, and a lot of those topics in the earlier stages, and this is where a lot of the development work is still very nascent, but you can sit and talk about this with adults, but you can't just sit and talk for hours about this with kids. So figuring out ways to introduce these concepts very much through play. So coming up with different types of games where we, interact with each other in a class to learn about some of these concepts and start to practice them. Um,
It's great. Yeah, she has a lot of imaginative play, so a lot of
mhm.
we can have a lot of she's learned a lot of things through our imaginative play games. And then also books. Are there children's books for that age that are good or earlier? Like, are there some children's books you like that
Yeah, that is actually not an area that I've delved much into yet, which might sound a little bit strange, because I know that there are probably great books out there. I know that there are great children's resources out there, but that's not kind of where I've started from. I've started from very much more of this, like, a world of adult stuff that I'm starting to, like,
Well, I
filter.
saw one, and I don't know if we ever read it to her or maybe she read it to her. I'll find it and put it in the show notes that was, like,
Mhm,
like, babies and sex and, like, it
mhm.
was very, very kid-friendly with cartoons and adult
Yeah.
appropriate, so I'll find that one, but yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff, and people have recommended a bunch to me too. I just haven't read through them yet, so I don't know them enough to recommend them back to you, but I know that especially this day and age, there's a lot of work being done out there to try to make things more updated when it comes to gender identity and sexual persuasion and things like that. Just really, make them more contemporary and more relevant to our culture today. Um, yeah.
And then should we skip straight to teenagers? 'Cause I'm dying to hear how you talk to teenagers because 'cause they're, like, the most uncomfortable. Is there in between 8, like, and, like, full-on teenager, like a kind of 10, 11, 12? Is there a different segment there? What kinda things do you talk?
Yeah, well, really, it's about building on themes year after year. And so I don't have it defined out enough in my curriculum to say we do this lesson this year and that lesson that year. But, as you start to get, you know, into some of those teenage years, um, actually having some more practical conversations around things like pleasure. which is something that I think especially parents are so afraid to address, like, "Oh my gosh, my child is not only maybe gonna become a parent someday when they get married, like, way, way, way off in the future, but, like, there's, masturbation and actually having, like, a pleasurable sexual experience and things to talk about with kids that are probably, for a lot of parents, like, a much edgier approach than the common sex education offerings that are out there. Um, but one of the things that I think is really important to empower young people with, especially coming from this foundation of self-love, that like I want to have an idea of like what is this landscape when I'm ready to start like moving out from myself and start making connections with other people, like what is available to me? Because if I'm looking at pornography or even if I'm looking at like music videos and R-rated movies or whatever, I'm seeing what feels like a very limited and really kind of intense list of like I'm either like by myself or I'm like connecting with people and it looks like this. And actually, there's like a really slow, gradual, and beautiful on ramp to those extremes that I think it's really important to share and talk to kids about and teach kids about so that as they naturally become curious and interested in their own bodies and exploring connections with other people, it's like, hey, you don't have to jump way into the deep end just because you think you feel ready or maybe you're dating someone and you really care about them and you think you do want to have a deep relationship with them. Like you don't necessarily have to jump to oral sex or penetrative sex. There's like a million other ways to like connect to your own body, your own pleasure, and have like real intimacy with another person that's actually way better calibrated to where they are developmentally, that's way safer in terms of a lot of the potential risks that are out there to them physically and emotionally. And yeah, so I'm excited to actually like bring that awareness and that education into my
Because
program.
8 feels a little early for that conversation, but, like, 14 feels a little late. So, like, is that there's sort of that, like, 10, 11, like, some, like, kinda the tween conversation is where you start
Yeah,
when
yeah. I mean, I think especially when we start to talk about masturbation and self-pleasure, um, you know, especially for girls, like, there I think boys, as woeful as most all of our educations are around things, boys tend to get a little bit more um education when it comes to their own bodies and their pleasure, maybe just because of the way that boys talk to each other. But
or societal appropriateness for male sexuality, like, male sex
yeah.
or something. I mean, I think I was probably 7 or 8 when I started having sexual pleasure and
Mhm.
figuring that out. I guess I'm for the dads out there, I'm ignorant on what it is for girls. Is that around the same for girls that they start to feel
It could be a lot of different ages. I was probably around 5,
okay,
like when and I didn't know what it was. I had no
okay, so my
it
dad
wasn't even really like
probably having some experience of sensation.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and
okay.
so I do think, as we start to teach kids about their bodies and how special and important their genitals are, not only because we wanna keep them safe, we wanna keep them private, but because they are, like, there's a lot of pleasure to be had in those areas, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's, appropriate places and times where we can explore that, and that knowing about yourself in that way is actually a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, so how do you bring that how would you recommend you bring up masturbation to a kid? You know,
Mhm.
like, anywhere from it could be as young as 8, but, like, 9, 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there, probably good to talk about it. How do you broach that topic?
Yeah, well, I think putting kids on the spot and asking them direct questions about, like, have you ever done this or that might be a little intense for an opening conversation. And having more of a conversation about, like, you know, hey, we've talked about, we'll take the female anatomy. Like, we've talked about the female anatomy. We understand these parts and we know what they're called. And like, let's dig into that a little bit more. Like, these areas that you may or may not have noticed in your own experience when you've, touched these areas, when you've been taking a bath or whatever, that they feel different. That feels different when you touch this as opposed to when you touch, the back of your hand or your arm or something. And there's a reason for that, and just as not matter of factly, but neutrally and without shame, say um this is what our bodies are made to do, and it's natural, and it can be a really beautiful part of getting to be human and getting to be in this body.
And
And
should
there's
my
nothing to be
wife should only moms talk to girls about that, or boys talk to boys, or does it matter?
I wouldn't put a boundary around that. I mean, there are dads raising daughters and moms raising sons. Um, and I'm definitely my intention is for my program to be taught within cohorts of children that are of mixed gender, so that we're all learning about each other's parts. I think it's just as important for boys to understand the menstrual cycle as it is for girls, and I think it's really important for us all to understand. This is something that one of the authors I referenced earlier, Emily Nagoski, says over and over and so wonderfully, is that we're all made of the same parts, just organized in different ways. Like, boys and girls actually have the same organs and the same component parts, and they've just developed and expressed themselves in these different ways that they appear to be different, but functionally, and especially when it comes to pleasure, are actually very much the same. And understanding not just our own bodies, but another body that doesn't look exactly like mine, even if it's another female body and I'm a female, or a male body and you're a male, like, again, it starts to create, like, less shame, more understanding, um, and yeah, just more wholeness.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to talk with my wife about how to do that. I hold the hard conversations card in our fair play system of health management. So like that would just I'm just better with hard conversations and I'm just better with answering those. I'm more comfortable. Technically, this would be my realm, I guess, even though I
Yeah.
was only a woman should talk to about so I could get out of it, but that sounds like not, so I'll have to decide, but it sounds like we've progressed from, yeah, to, like, relationships and love and bodies to babies and sex and then the mechanics of sex into pleasure and, like, masturbation and pleasuring oneself, and then, kind of in this which we're kind of reaching in here at age 8, we're sort of entering into that sort of self-pleasure discussion, and then we get into, like, the relationship, like, different ways to interact sexually with another person. Is that, like is there an age that that should happen at? Or I know you're not very prescriptive about that, so but it sounds like probably
Yeah.
12.
I imagine sometime between 10 and 12, you
Yeah.
you start, I mean, kids start being like, "Oh, I have my,
Yeah, like,
boyfriend or
boyfriend,
girlfriend
girl,
at
going on a
school," or
date,
whatever,
yeah,
this or
kiss.
that. We're holding hands.
Yeah.
I mean, we can even start to talk about, again, like, before, or not necessarily having sex be a part of, um, the conversation, just why do we as humans, sometimes want to pair up with another human? Or why does it feel really good to get really close to another person? What, and talk about um attraction and intimacy, even if it's just a platonic attraction. Like, what draws us to want to be close to other people? What's exciting about that? What's stimulating about that? How can we show up as people that that contribute to a healthy dynamic within a partnership and a friendship.
Love
You
that.
know,
What is a relationship for? Like, why would we do this? Is great. Rather than
yeah.
not for, which is easy to teach that. Like, you shouldn't be abused and they shouldn't be mean and they shouldn't, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself. But like, no, you should feel good about yourself. It sounds like with your marriage, if you knew, that I'm supposed to feel good. I'm supposed to feel more alive. I'm supposed to feel connected. That was what
Mm.
that was for, that it might have gone a little.
Right. Yeah. Like that if actually, if I had a better awareness that bringing my full self and making my light as bright as it possibly could be, so to speak, is actually maybe a pathway to a stronger, healthy relationship than like putting someone else's needs above mine, which we see that start to happen even in the earliest friendships. If we think about like I really want to run with the cool kids, and
Especially
so
with
I might
yeah.
dress a certain way or talk a certain way or pretend to be interested in certain things because I so desire the company of those people. I mean that, extrapolated over a lifetime, that's behavior that can lead to, toxic entanglement and codependency and a lot of things. I mean, these are it might sound extreme to start talking about that at such an earlier age, but I really do think that like if we again start from this foundation of self-love and self-confidence, that we also might be teaching our kids how to pick their friends better, or model like, hey, I can run with the cool kids and be exactly who I am. I don't dress like any of them. I don't do that, and they all still want to hang out with me. Like just like giving kids the confidence to love themselves enough to show up authentically as themselves every day in all of their relationships. Like that's
I love
that's
that
I
you're talking about sex with another person starts with talking about relating with another person. It is that for it should feel good. It should have us feel light.
Yeah,
It should have us feel connect. Should feel safe. It should feel, like
right.
exciting, pleasurable. And so it's sort of like that's a natural segue into, and therefore any physical touch involved in that should also reflect that. And if at any point it is not that, then, just like you don't have to wear the clothes to be with the cool kids, you don't have to engage in certain kinds of touch or sexuality if you don't want to.
Right. Yeah, or I don't have to do something that I'm not ready to do because that person isn't gonna like me anymore. You can develop a foundation of connection that you can rely on and not wonder like, "Oh, do I have to do something that's out of my own integrity because I'm trying to preserve this thing, that maybe needs to be let go."
And then yeah, how do they know when they're ready? That's sort of like a big question. And I see how
Mhm.
I was taught there's rules, not till you're married, not till you're out of this house, these kind of fixed rules that never taught me, do I want it or not? Does it feel right to me or not? It was just like TV said men pursue sex, and the more sex you get, the better man you are. And then parents saying sex is forbidden, you can't have it ever until you're married. And
Right.
my parents' sex life was probably not very good. So like, so it's like that wasn't a great model. And so like it's I can see how like teaching them that intrinsic to know is it right or not. Like you know if you're ready or not. Like there's no specific age or rule. But I do have this pretty strong belief that if they are intrinsically connected, they probably wouldn't feel right to be super sexual at age 12.
Mhm,
16,
mhm.
17 probably would. Like they probably could. And a lot of kids, teenagers do, and there is a safe way to do
Yeah.
that. And, like that is very common. But they might not. Like I also know 18-year-olds that have still not felt ready. And it's not because they were shamed. It's not because they were restricted. They just like it was all right for them. And they had that they were dating. So it does seem like if you teach this, if parents are worried about kids having sex too early, it almost seems like the best thing you could do is tell them it's okay to have sex when you're ready, and here's how you know if you're ready.
Yeah, here's how you know if you're ready, and here's, like, not just the happy hour menu of what sex is with the, like, 4 or 5 items, but, like, there's a threefold menu of all of these different things, and you know what? Start over here in the appetizers because you might find that, like, Just some of that is, like, deeply nourishing, deeply connective, deeply satisfying, and you don't have to start getting into some of the other stuff that you're actually not ready to do.
And so that's, age-wise of talking about the menu, the full menu. Like, I guess that, you're letting the kid lead, but probably 13, 14. That's sort of that
Yeah.
kind of later age curriculum around
Mhm.
how do you bring that up? And I know you start with, like, what are relationships for and how's that feeling? I assume maybe it would be had if they are already in a relationship. Would you say it when they're starting to date? Or
I would say whether they've started dating or not, like, this concept of dating is around them, they see it, and they might be participating in it, somewhat unconsciously of like, "Oh, I like this person. What does that mean? I don't know what that means," and getting into, like, what like, we could even talk about, like, oxytocin and serotonin and the things in our bodies that get released when we get to have these experiences, giving them some awareness and understanding, um, about what's happening in their body and why it's so exciting to get to, be with these people in these different kinds of ways. But also, not just in like a physical sort of cold scientific way, but just like, yeah, like it makes sense, as a human being that we want to be close and connected to people and there's nothing wrong with the desire for that closeness and that intimacy. And here are all of these different ways that you could explore that in ways that are truly aligned with what you want, what you desire. And again, getting back to the, early stages of like knowing my feelings and my needs and being able to name them. Like, what am I truly desiring here? And is it my desire or am I like being a chameleon for someone else's desire and trying to like live up to that standard? It opens up a really, really wide conversation, um, for sure.
and in
Yeah,
the
I love
movies, the teenagers are always super uncomfortable. The parent says, "Oh, we should have the talk," and they're like, "Dad, no." I've no conversation I've ever had with my daughter's been like that. Like every conversation, she's never uncomfortable talking about anything. Like she can ask any question, we talk about it, like whatever it is, and she's never like feels uncomfortable about a topic. So, is it possible for a teenager to have an open, comfortable, relatively comfortable conversation with a parent about all the different possible sex acts and it not feel, like, really
it.
weird to them?
That is such a good question, and it really takes us back to the earlier, conversation about, like, why are parents awkward about having conversations with their kids, or why are kids awkward about having conversations with their parents? My hope and belief is that, um, not everybody is gonna start my program at age 8 and go all the way through age 18. We're gonna catch people at a lot of different places, and they're gonna come and go. I know that. But even if you just come through for one round, and you're part of a cohort and there's, maybe 20 other kids, that's 20 other families who've all signed up to have this deep, meaningful conversation about sex. And we're not having the kids and the parents in the same room, by the way. It's like there's a class for the kids and there's a class for the parents. Um, but within that child, there is an understanding now that my parents care about this. They want me to know about this. They're putting effort into learning about this themselves. Those are some things that I know that I didn't have as a child growing up. I didn't have that backdrop to any conversation I maybe needed to have about sex with my parents. But even if I'm not still after that comfortable talking with my parents, I now am connected to a community of 20 families. And maybe there's one adult in those 20 families that I do have a relationship to that I could go to and say, hey, maybe I'm in a moment of crisis. Maybe I do have an unwanted pregnancy or I've had an unwanted sexual experience and I need someone to talk to about it. Now rather than having this isolated kid, they've got peers and parents, a whole community of them, of people that they know who have at least some of the shared language and tools from this program that they can reach out to. And that's like the meat and potatoes of this. It's like there's stuff they get in front of me when they're working with me in class, but it's really beyond this. You're out there living your life on a day-to-day basis. You have this family unit that wants to have children grow up with a healthy understanding about sex and relationships. And like it requires a lifetime of ongoing conversation and support. Um, and I'm not going to be around for most of that time.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're getting into teenagers. There's all the different types of sex. I assume there's also like safe sex and STIs and things like that. Like, how do you talk about that with teenagers?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the approaches that we probably got in our generation, which were very like either like abstinence is the only way or like you will get pregnant and you will get AIDS and you will die, you know? And it's just like, okay, well, that's not, neither of those are really realistic or the whole story or anything close to it. And so, like anything else, like having a really like clear and honest conversation of like, there are risks involved when you open yourself up to deep intimacy with another person. There's risks to yourself emotionally and how that can affect your sense of self-worth, your connection to your community, like your just there's risks there and then there's these other risks about pregnancy, about STIs, some that, could be with you for the rest of your life. And so, when we teach kids driver's ed, we don't only tell them like, here's how you parallel park and here's how you use your blinkers and stuff like that. We also say, you know, we show them images of accidents. We talk about drunk driving. We talk about the risks and the responsibilities of getting behind the wheel of a car. And we have to have those conversations with kids as well. We have to let them know, and this is a big one too, about how even like even with our best intentions, we could inflict real damage upon another person if we create a situation that they're not actually consenting to and end up giving them an unwanted, sexual experience of some kind. I think all of those conversations have to happen, and they have to happen in a way that's honest, but also balanced, compassionate, and leaves a lot of room for questions and conversation.
I love the driving metaphor because it's something that is treated as inevitable. You will drive, you will learn to drive. I might even want you to learn to drive. Like it's my job to teach you to drive. It's something every adult does. You will do it for the rest of your life. There are inherent risks, but there's a lot of ways you can be safe and but you're going to do it. So here's how to do it safely. I love that idea of like, that's how you talk about sex. Like, this is an inevitable thing, like 90, some late, like 99% of the planet or whatever, like there's some group of asexual people, but it's a very small group. Most people are gonna have be sexual in some way. So like, let's talk about it in an ongoing way. Like, we start it now and we continue to have it. So by the time we're talking about this as a teenager, it's not, "Oh, we never had that talk, let's talk about it now, and let's" too late. Like, I've already watched the porn, I've already learned that it's a taboo topic, and now, like, you're the last person I wanna talk to that about, and so,
Right.
like,
Totally.
goals we start now to nurture this conversation, so by the time we're teaching them about it, just like we're teaching them driving, or we're teaching them cooking, or
Yeah.
teaching them how to do their taxes.
Totally. In some of the group conversations I've had around the development of this work, I'll have a group of parents in room and say, name some qualities for me of what you find attractive in another person. That could be a friend or a partner or a lover. And I'm not talking about their looks. I'm not talking about their status or how much money they have. Like, what are some qualities that make a person attractive to you? And, I get words like kind, confident, trustworthy, soulful, passionate, a good listener. These are
Cast host,
qualities.
you know?
Podcast hosts, yeah, that would maybe be another category, not necessarily a quality. Um, I'm like, okay, we can see that we want that in our partners. Maybe we actually also see that we want that for ourselves. Like, I want to be described as confident and trustworthy and passionate or whatever. And then I ask them to think about like, would you also want that for your children? Would you want your children to be described as, compassionate and a good listener and confident and knows their desires, all of these things. And all of the parents always say, yes, absolutely. I want that for my kid, even though it maybe makes me uncomfortable to think about them in the context of being attractive to another person. We do want that for our children, but then it's like, well, how do they grow up to be like that? Do we just like pray that we're role modeling that enough for them, or they're somehow going to be like surrounded by good friends and they're just going to like naturally grow into that? Like some kids do, but I think that we can um like through some of these interventions actually try to plan for those outcomes, actually try to like achieve those outcomes with more predictability when we give them some of these tools that we've been discussing today to help them be that kind, confident, curious, trustworthy person.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, cool. Well, that's great. There's been so many great resources here. I feel a lot more equipped to have these conversations to take it to the next level and onward as my daughter grows up. Super excited to hear about your program when it gets launched. So definitely let me know. We'll promote that
Thank you.
on the channels and so forth. But yeah, really appreciate you talking, good becoming educated on this really important but difficult topic and coming on today to do it, even though you're not quite ready. Your program's not done. I appreciate you coming on and talking off the hook of off the cuff of what you learned so far. Yeah, I think it'd be really valuable.
Thank you so much, Joe. Yeah, it's been fun. I love talking about this, so I'm really, really appreciative of the opportunity. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, y'all, and stay dedicated.